The Iron Age was truly the age of the Celts in much of Europe, and this aggressive period of domination, which saw the Celts sack Rome and run rampant through Greece, was closely tied to the mastery of the great secrets of iron. The method of forging large quantities of swords out of iron became prominent with the Celtic Hallstatt culture in the 8th century BC, who were among the first to adopt the widespread use of iron swords in Europe. Though the Hallstatt culture begins in the Bronze Age around 1200 BC, by the period known as Hallstatt C, they transition to iron. For the Greeks and others in the Mediterranean, the eventual adoption of iron swords was brought about at least partly by the decline in the tin trade, a necessary component in the creation of bronze, and this made bronze much more expensive than it had been previously. Iron had been known about for some centuries, but it did not immediately replace bronze for several reasons. The process of extracting the ore and bringing it up to a workable quantity is taxing. It involves higher temperatures, which were difficult to achieve in rudimentary earthen furnaces. And it also requires large amounts of fuel to generate and sustain the temperatures. Iron has many impurities that need to be reduced, and despite popular belief, early iron, that is, low-carbon iron, isn't significantly better or even at all better than bronze in many respects. Iron cannot simply cut through bronze, and for some evidence of this, bronze armor continues to be used even in the Roman period. Bronze swords were made by cast, that is, the bronze is melted down into a pre-made shape cut into a stone usually. While this sounds easier, there are various things that can go wrong in the process which will require an entire restart. That means remelting the bronze, which is an expensive and lengthy process. Bronze cannot be forge welded, nor can it be worked hot. While the initial process of acquiring the iron is more laborious, the material is more forgiving to work with and allows for greater complexity of design. Consider the difficulty in molding correctly the socket of a spear point. Now, this is why many early bronze spear points are not socketed, but this makes the connection between the spear point and the spear shaft much weaker and more prone to breaking. This is because the socket likely would require a 3-piece mold, and if the core of the mold is out of line, the entire thing becomes useless and needs to be remelted at a great expense of time and resources. With iron, it is worked hot and pounded into shape. If a mistake is made, it can simply be pounded back and attempted again. Iron, however, is readily available almost anywhere, and is therefore much cheaper and easier to obtain. The widespread working of iron shows a high degree of technical knowledge and social organization to support the industry around it. Once mastered, iron can be very versatile. It is also generally less dense and therefore of a lighter weight than bronze. Between a bronze and an iron sword of the same size, the bronze sword will always be heavier and will always need to be thicker for stability. This means that an iron sword can be longer while also being more resistant to bending. The smiths of the Hallstatt Celts gained an early understanding of the techniques of forging swords with iron and were among the first in Europe to do so. Yet the style of the bronze sword was still very much in favor, perhaps for reasons of tradition. Many of the earliest iron swords are simply iron copies of bronze swords. Despite being a relatively new product, the earliest examples of iron swords are produced with the same beauty as its bronze predecessors, with several well-preserved examples of the level of detail and vast amount of time that must have gone into producing these weapons of the warrior elite. The most stunning of these early iron swords is the Mindel sword from the Oss burial in the Netherlands. The sword was sacrificially killed and buried along with its owner, who must have been a regional chieftain of some renown. 2 fullers run down the length of the blade, which ends in a rather blunt triangular point. Near the base, the blade forms 2 stylized points, which may or may not have any practical application. The grip is wood, studded with gold, encasing and riveted to a single-piece tang. Though I could not find exact measurements for length of this particular sword, this sword is the origin for the category of the Hallstatt sword known as the Mindel type, which generally have a length of between 32 and 38 inches, comparable in size to later medieval longswords. However, the center of balance is much further down the blade, marking the sword as a decisive and dedicated cutter. Another interesting thing we see on most of these swords, whether Mindelheim type or Gundelin type, is that the blade becomes wider towards the middle. This is true of the bronze and the iron versions. While this might add to the chopping strength of the sword, it's also possible that it may help resist bending upon impact. What we see in this example of a Mindelheim sword from approximately 800 BC is superb craftsmanship and a mastery of the techniques of forging with iron that far surpasses any earlier examples found in the Eastern Mediterranean, and even call into question exactly where advanced ironsmithing techniques actually came from. There is no question that advanced iron forging was occurring much before the production date of this sword. It would have taken generations of advancement in the use of techniques to produce a blade such as this, clearly the work of a dedicated professional. There are numerous other examples of early Celtic iron swords, which far surpass early Eastern examples, but even late Iron Age examples. While some believe that the Celts gained knowledge of iron from the East, which had entered into early iron production around 1200 BC, when the first evidence of iron working has been dated, yet the level of technical expertise exhibited by the Celtic examples is clearly on an entirely different level, and it would not be a stretch at all to think that the Celts in Europe had been developing methods of ironsmithing since at least that date as well, to have produced examples such as this in 800 BC. If they did originally acquire the knowledge of ironworking from the East, it was they who mastered the techniques and took them to the next level. When Romans and Greeks talk in later periods of the enormous swords of the Celts, it is examples comparable to this from the later Latin designs. Compared to the average sword size of Romans and Greeks, a 36-inch sword blade is massive. A gladius, for instance, measures generally about 25 inches. The total length of the sword, including pommel, was smaller than just the blade of the larger type of Iron Age Celtic sword. Congruent with the Mindelheim sword type during the Hallstatt period was the Gundelin type, similar in many respects but often significantly smaller, and more often made of bronze, likely as iron was not required for the short blade length. The Gundelin type was more numerous. In Ireland in particular, the Gundelin type was very short and was much more common. A characteristic common in period C Hallstatt swords, both bronze and iron versions, are the Mexican hat style pommels. Sometimes the hilt and pommel are wooden, other times they are ivory or bronze or even iron themselves, but generally the same style persists in all mediums. This general style seems to be connected to the broader aesthetic in the Hallstatt culture. There are also examples of antlered pommels, which become more prominent during the transition period to daggers in Hallstatt D. I am unsure if detailed studies on the types of forging techniques have been done specifically on the Hallstatt C examples, but from later Celtic Iron Age examples we see that they make use of piling, that is, face welding several different layers of iron together. In some Latin examples, pattern welding is also present, which is perhaps best known as the technique employed by the much later Norse smiths. Some swords were also forged out of a single piece of iron, but these are a minority, and they would have been of an inferior quality. The swords of the Hallstatt period especially, it should be stressed, were not steel swords, but predominantly iron, which may have had some edges or parts that were steel, either by design or by accident. While some swords contain an edge which is steel, generally the majority of the sword is composed of iron. However, the techniques of faggoting and folding were known to the Celts before 700 BC. Faggoting is the process of combining layers of separate bars or sticks of iron, piled together, faggots, forged, welding them together and folding them over. This works out or distributes slag inclusions and makes the iron more homogeneous in regards to its phosphorus content, which was a big element in Celtic sword strengthening. The phosphorus content helps make a stronger iron. This is closely related to the folding technique today, most associated with the art of Japanese sword making. Similar processes were also used very early in Europe as well, as proven by various studies of ancient Celtic swords. However, it had not yet developed into a fully understood process as it developed in the Japanese style, and thus the results varied. The techniques of the Hallstatt Celts were very advanced for their time, and though they were not aware of things like water quenching, they produced arguably some of the best early iron swords. Hallstatt-type swords, smithing techniques, and weapon designs spread throughout West, Central, and Northern Europe. There were regional variations of design, but the general type seemed to have remained relatively intact. Despite this, the Hallstatt Celts eventually phased out the production and widespread use of swords, switching instead to spears and very ornate daggers. The sword, however, reappears with the emergence of the Celtic Latin culture in an even more widespread and impressive fashion. But that, my friends, is for another time. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, support us on the Patreon channel. Tapile ver sanestiach, agus Marigoni, Shas Gohard.